stocks. Now the European Commission has introduced strict limits on the quantity of fish being caught. Next month, the British government introduces a new law to enforce the quotas. UK fishermen say it will annihilate their industry and that the restrictions are much tougher than those facing their European counterparts. Bob Parker has been listening to fishermen's grievances.
It's 4:45 in the morning and the Atlantis, one of nearly 60 fishing boats based in Plymouth, leaves harbour. Skipper Jim Ivey is the third generation of his family to have fished from here. But now, like many others, he wants out.
The industry as it stands at the moment it's the worst in our lifetime as we've ever known it. Because you're being forced with the rising costs and the deterioration of the fish stocks. It's just pushing you to the edge of bankruptcy, really.
As the Atlantis leaves Plymouth behind, she heads for far beyond the Eddystone Lighthouse. After 2 hours steaming, she reaches her ground nearly 30 miles out in the Channel. This boat, like many others all round Britain, can already barely make ends meet. But under the Seafish Conservation Act, which comes into operation in the near future, the Atlantis and other boats in the British fleet will have to stay in port for perhaps 3 or 4 months every year, on top of the quotas already imposed by the EC.
The government wants to restrict us even more for going to sea next year or later this year. They want to keep us in for another 3-4 months a year, which, if you can't make a living now, there's no way you're going to make a living in the future anyway.
The idea of the Act is to conserve the dwindling fish stocks as part of the overall targets of the EC fisheries policy. But what annoys fishermen is that other EC fishermen, they say, won't be subject to the same measures.
The effect of it will be to tie up many of the boats, particularly in the southwest, for up to 3 or 4 days per week. Now, quite clearly, it's an absolute nonsense to suggest that that will conserve fish stocks when the French and the Spanish and our other European counterparts will carry on fishing the same waters and the same stocks as us. What possible conservation benefits will there be, bearing in mind that they have much lower standards of enforcement in fisheries than we do?
After 2 hours in which the weather has worsened, the Atlantis hauls in her nets after her first trawl. British fishermen say that they, more than anybody, know that too many boats are chasing too few fish. This is the result. A miserably small catch, and one that's all too typical.
Not very good. Not very good.
For the crew who work a 16 to 18-hour day, when the weather permits, it's bad news because they're paid only on the basis of a share of the catch.
That's a small red mullet, that is.
What sort of wages are you both going to earn this week?
Well, I mean, I would have said around £60–70.
Yes, about £60–70, which isn't a lot for 5–6 days at sea.
But the feeling is very much the same across the Channel in France. This French fishing boat, Le Jolibat, which fishes for scallops, has had its income so badly affected by the depletion of stocks and the restrictions of EC quotas that its skipper says he can't make a living. This is the boat's last expedition before the government buys it out. But in Cherbourg last week, the French were landing what seemed to be plentiful supplies of crab. The French government has no plans, like the British government, to restrict French fishing boats to port. Their method of achieving EC conservation targets is to reduce the engine size of the fishing fleet, because they think the smaller the engine, the smaller the catch. So far, there's been a reduction of 10% in the total engine size of boats working on the French side of the Channel. The French government has spent more than £20 million on buying up French boats to take them out of fishing. The British government is also trying this. It's offering £25 million over the next 3 years, a sum the British say isn't enough. In Plymouth, the Atlantis' catch is auctioned off the following morning at the fish market.
159, 60, 159, 60, 150, 60, 150, tiny.
Before the auction starts, the fish is checked by 2 inspectors from the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, who make sure quotas aren't broken and that small fish isn't landed. There are nearly 200 such inspectors around the ports of Britain, and British fishermen say they're subject to very much stricter supervision than in other EC countries.
Our British Fisheries Minister, in his wisdom, knows perfectly well that once the French and the Spanish have caught their quota, he believes that they will stop fishing and will not land anymore. No, they're not policed at all. They have far less inspectors than we do, and nobody bothers to check the French boats. It's quite clear that the French authorities are frightened of the French and Spanish fishermen.
But what evidence is there for the French and the Spanish and other EC fishermen overfishing their quotas?
In Spain, they have 17 inspectors only. They've got the biggest fleet in the EC, and those 17 inspectors are based in the wonderful port of Madrid. So perhaps that would sum it all up for you.
In Cherbourg, one of the main fishing ports on the North French coast, they disagree. This vessel checks the fishing boats out at sea to make sure they're sticking to the rules. But the captain told us that they can rarely do quayside checks because his vessel also doubles up as a lifeboat.
We have a crew of 7, so if I send 3 or 4 down to the quayside for inspection, and if we get an emergency call, we're not crewed to respond. We do quayside inspections, but not regularly.
It is true that other people are not enforcing as rigorously as we are.
The French and the Spanish?
The French and the Spanish are not enforcing as rigorously as we are, though I think they have all been pushed into much more heavy enforcement. But you think, well, wait a minute, if the industry is saying, well, if they're not enforcing, we don't want the enforcement in Britain. We want to have the same laxity as they do. We want the same right to plunder the seas as they do. And basically, if they are raping the stocks, we want to rape the stocks as well. Then they should say so very clearly, because that is not my policy. And don't exaggerate the extent to which we enforce either. It is true that we've got 5 Royal Navy vessels around the British coasts. It is true we've got 3 aircraft. We do have a very vigorous enforcement policy. But we only inspect on average about, what, 1 in 70 landings?
Few would dispute that fishing faces a crisis, not just in Britain, but in Europe and many other parts of the world, and that drastic measures must be taken to give the industry a future. But the British fishermen's conviction that the measures being applied against them are much tougher than against their European competitors is likely to intensify the trouble there's already been in the fishing ports. And for areas like the southwest, the economy of whole communities is at stake.
Robert Parker. Tonight's main news, there's to be